Welcome to Doing the Work, a virtual question and answer on what settlers need to know about the residential school system in Canada. This is an event that is sponsored by the University of Manitoba's Centre for Human Rights Research and by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. The University of Manitoba's campuses are located on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Ojibwe, Dene, and Métis people. And today, many of us in the room speak to you from the part of the province that is governed by the promises of Treaty 1 and of the Manitoba Act, and where we drink water from Shoal Lake in Treaty 3. My name is Adele Perry. I am a settler historian, and I'm also honored to be the director of the Centre for Human Rights Research. I wanted to make sure that I had time to thank everyone who is part of today's event in all the many ways that people are, and also to thank two people who you may not see but have been critical to this, and that is Kayla Johnson, Supervisor of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming at the NCTR, and Pauline Tennant, Manager of the CHRR. Today's event takes place at a moment where Canada is having another step in its ongoing reckoning with the past and present of colonialism, and where the 150-year history of residential schooling fits within it. Doing the Work as an event has its immediate origins in a Twitter thread where Sean Carleton, one of our panelists, offered to respond to settlers' questions about residential schools. He got more than 3,000 responses, and it seemed clear that there was a need for more. Doing the Work as an event is informed by three related ideas: that settlers and non-Indigenous people have a responsibility to both learn about and be accountable for the history of residential schooling, that the heavy lifting of researching, writing, and speaking and teaching about these histories cannot be borne by Indigenous peoples alone, and that our engagement on these questions must center Indigenous scholarship, writing, stories, creation, and brilliance. We have been honored, we are very much honored to be supported and guided in today's event by two elders and knowledge keepers, and I will begin by introducing them. And first is Betty Ross. Betty Ross is originally from Pimicikamak First Nation, also known as Cross Lake in Treaty 5. She is a residential school survivor of 2 schools and spent more than 15 years in the system. Her pride and joy today are her 2 sons, 2 daughters, 15 grandsons, and 6 great-grandchildren. Betty retired from the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority in March 2018, where she worked as a spiritual and cultural care provider. She's currently involved with the Seven Oaks School Division as an elder in residence, where she shares her residential school history, Sugar Falls, with kindergarten to grade 8 students. Betty is also busy as a community elder, devoting her time to the Kairos blanket exercises, to social justice and climate change, and she teaches Cree classes every Wednesday evening. More recently, Betty has been involved at Red River College, sharing her knowledge, her language, songs, and so forth. She has been gifted as a knowledge keeper, a sacred pipe and medicine carrier. She humbly shares these gifts and teachings today and forward through the generations. And we are very much honored that she is able to join us today. We also have with us Clayton Sandy. Clayton Sandy's parents are of Dakota descent. His father is Kanawapka Dakota from Kanawapka Dakota First Nation, and his mother is from Sioux Valley Dakota First Nation, where Clayton is a registered member. Both of his parents and 5 older siblings are residential school survivors, and Clayton is himself a survivor of the 60s scoop. Clayton retired from the Manitoba government after 39 years of service. He feels he spent many of those years doing what he somewhat jokingly, though probably not jokingly in certain ways, refers to as Indian 101. And he retired in 2016. A month after his retirement, he and Dr. Raymond Curry, formerly of the University of Manitoba, were the founders of Circles for Reconciliation. And he is happy to be a part of a wider journey that we are all also a part on. So I will turn things first to Elder Betty Ross and ask her to start us off in a good way, and then we will move to Elder Sandy.
Kansen totemak mineni tena nagiskata ko kanung skagitsigag. Emenugisigag. Kiwasiemit na agagino. Gipe mini gawin sistema kita machitan tapas kite panigo magekon kaya kani mutamagan skagitsigag. Ako ani yung ngait na mo giseman tu sistema. Winat te pinay kita sa wenitak umagaita kami kisiagan skagitsigag. Tapoy nanas ko man. Good afternoon, all my relations. I'm so honored to be here today with you to discuss whatever that needs to be discussed today in good ways. I have accepted the tobacco from Pauline, and I will offer this tobacco to the Creator in my own language, in my first language, which is Cree. So at this point in time, I'm inviting you to close your eyes and go deep within the recesses of your being. There you will see an ember of light. Focus on that ember of light and be grateful for who you are and where you are today. So this is where I start my prayer in Cree. Agis ay man tu ginalas kumitna na nus kagitsigisigat. Minapego kawaste na mawiyag, minatatot tipis kakawaste na mawiyag taski. Kinanas kumitnan gisay man tu nus kagitsigisigat. E pagusay ni mitagit apesyo sa kita tuskay naganak. Nugo minanak ni musu minanak. Wina kita pesa winitagit. Umanus kagitsigisigat. O magaysiya mituag tapo inusi. Kita sa winitago. Kita pas kita pan ni kagin umamit to ni kanyo minawito ko anus kagitsigisigat. Pues kita stu tamagaygon. Tani mo tamag. E gusani giseman tu. Kinanas kumitnan. So when naming minate pinanyo piko minanak no si minanak tas kuta pananak. Wisto kita minupmute si kutaski. Sige mawa anus kaita kami kisiyag winaw mautse. Pues kita matsit si kita wastenig. Umes ka na wisto. E kusani kiseman tu stege wan gawi utaski kita isi. Minoayak kinanas kumitnan. E kusani nung guminanak ni musu guminanak. Kaperichi ka pawista uyak. Anus kagitsigisigat. Kinanas kumitnan. Misimitnan. E kusani. Nanas kumunan. Kageke. Mina kageke. Amen. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I have offered the sacred tobacco to the Creator, which is very crucial in every gathering that we put Creator first and foremost in our lives, because He's the source of all living, right? Everything that's alive today. So I guess we will start in good terms. And I also brought my eagle feather. Eagle feather represents the truth. So whatever we will discuss today, whatever that needs to be discussed, it has to be the truth. Today, this year, 2021, is the Truth and Reconciliation era. But I do believe that the truth has to come first before we could tackle reconciliation, right? So each and every one of us will have to come to the truth of who we are, how we understand what happened to our history millenniums of years ago and what's happening today, but always in good ways, always in good ways. So we can start now. Whoever wants to come on now. I'm so honored, Debusani, and ask him it now.
Thank you, Elder Betty Ross, for that really important prayer and introduction. I'll now ask Elder Clayton Sandy to say a few words.
Thank you, Bitakiapi, Doka Yanua, Hemiedo Ichak Homani, Wakanta Kahomakiai. Said, hello people, how are you doing? My traditional name is Ichak Homani, walks with elk. I want to say it's a real pleasure to be here today. I think these kind of conversations are long overdue. In my bio, I mentioned that I think I've been doing Indian 101 for 40 years now, and all that work was in government. And it seems to be that I did that kind of work right up till my retirement in 2016. It still continues. I really hope that this afternoon that we can, like what Ross says, we can talk the truth. And one of the things that I think I've always felt and heard is that non-native people have a difficult time asking the hard questions, and sometimes they feel like they're gonna offend us. But I really encourage you today to ask those hard questions and don't worry about offending myself or Betty, because I think we've probably heard everything in our lives, and we'll probably respond to anything that you'd like to ask about us. Many times when I used to do my workshops in the 80s and the 90s in government, I would ask that question, and I'd ask participants to say whatever you want to say. I remember one time a lady that I actually knew, I worked with her in one of the departments, and she was probably about 45 years old. I think she had 3 kids also too. Her question she asked was, is it true that, and of course she said Native women, is it true that Native women wean their babies on alcohol? As to why Indians become alcoholics later on in life. Really, that kind of blew my mind, but it just made me wonder how long she's been carrying that around and how long she's been saying that to other people. And so I let her know the truth about that. It's amazing just to hear people say this, it made me wonder where she heard that from also too. And then just how many people have heard that. So those are the kind of, I think that the real myths that go around that people talk about, but people don't get clarification. I'm hoping that today we can, title this real clarification and sort of to get down to the grassroots and to the core of the issues, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Elder Sandy, for those really, I think, such powerful words that really put us on the right path. And I want to again thank both Elder Betty Ross and Elder Clayton Sandy for joining us today. I'm going to really quickly introduce, and I'm going to go in lightning speed through the panelists' very illustrious biographies, just so we can manage to keep this within an hour. And then we're going to get on to some of the many important questions we have received in advance. And I'll also just note there's a little over 120 people who have joined us online in this exercise so far. And I'm going to begin in alphabetical order and introduce Sean Carleton. Sean is a settler scholar whose research examines histories of colonialism, capitalism, and schooling in Canada. He's a founding member of the Graphic History Collective. Next, I'll introduce Brian Gettler, who's a historian of colonialism in Quebec and Canada. He's published articles in French and English, and most recently a book entitled Colonialism's Currency, Money, State, and First Nations in Canada, 1820 to 1950. In 2012, Gettler wrote a report on the histories of residential schooling in Quebec for the TRC, and he's currently working on finance and Crown First Nations relations. We also have Dr. Erin Millions on the line. She is a settler historian of colonialism, childhood, health, and Indigenous histories. She is currently research director of the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis Photo Project at the University of Winnipeg. She is also a member of the Welcoming Winnipeg Initiative, which aims to recenter Indigenous histories and perspectives in Winnipeg by revisiting naming and heritage and commemoration in the city. I'd also like to introduce our graphic recorder and artist, Kara Sievewright. Kara is an artist and writer who creates graphic and poetic social justice themes, comics, and illustration. She recently illustrated a graphic nonfiction book with Between the Lines and is working on her own graphic novel. She is a member of the Graphic History Collective, and she lives in Haida Gwaii as a settler on unceded Haida territories. And Kara will be graphically recording today's conversation and then working with the NCTR and with elders Clayton Sandy and Betty Ross to create a lasting and artistic rendition of our conversation. Next, I'd like to introduce Andrew Woolford. He's a professor of sociology and criminology, and he's the University of Manitoba and the former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He researches on histories of settler colonialism and critical genocide studies, as well as on intersections between ecocide and genocide. He's working on a number of community-based research projects, including Remembering Assiniboia, which focuses on commemoration of the Assiniboia Residential School in urban Winnipeg. Last but not least, we have Monique Woroniak. Monique has been with the Winnipeg Public Library since 2007, I never know how to say that right, 2007. Her kind of librarianship is focused on anti-oppressive approaches to service delivery, and more particularly on the ways that non-Indigenous organizations can responsibly learn and take direction from Indigenous peoples. She curates guides about the residential school system, about MMIWG2S, and about treaties. She has been on the Indigenous Matters Committee of the Canadian Federation of the Library Association. She's a past recipient of the Aboriginal Circle of Educators Award and is the co-founder of an important website called Groundwork for Change. So that is our panel. And now what we're going to do is take some of the many excellent questions we received in advance. So we're going to do so in alphabetical order. The panelists will read out their questions and then they will answer them, and then we will move to the next one. So that means that we're going to begin with Sean.
Okay, well, thanks to all of the attendees for making time to be here today. And to kick things off, I'm going to answer Erin from Brandon, Manitoba's question. It asks, I will be graduating from high school in 2022. I'm not Indigenous. What do you think is the best way to be involved in reconciliation work that is respectful? Where do you start? That's a great question that I hear a lot. At this time, there is a lot of energy coming from non-Indigenous people wanting to get involved and help Canada achieve reconciliation, which is great. At this difficult time, however, as many Indigenous communities are actively searching former school sites for missing loved ones and deceased children who never made it home, I think the best thing to do is to really commit yourself to learning first the truth about residential schooling. As is often said, we need truth before reconciliation, as Elder Betty Ross reminded us in the opening, and the Eagle Feather is there to remind us as we go through this event. And I think there is a danger right now of rushing reconciliation and leaving the truth behind. So a great place to begin your own reconciliation journey is to first commit to reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's executive summary of their 2015 final report on the history and ongoing effects of colonialism and residential schooling, as well as the Commission's 94 calls to action. You can find the report and calls to action online for free, and we can share that resource with you, or you can contact your local bookstore and have them order you a copy of the reports or the edited and abridged version, much cheaper and shorter, called A Knock on the Door. You can kind of see that, put out by the University of Manitoba Press. And again, we'll give you that resource. From there, the next step would be to talk with your family, friends, fellow students, and coworkers about the report. Encourage them to read it alongside you. Then you could contact your MP or your MLA and city councilors and ask them if they have read the report, and question them as to what they're doing to implement the 94 calls to action. We don't need to reinvent the wheel or make more work for Indigenous communities at a difficult time. We need to take our responsibility for first learning the truth and demanding that Canada address the 94 calls to action coming out of the TRC. So that's a great place to start that takes your own role in reconciliation work seriously and respectfully.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm going to now pass the question torch over to Brian, who's going to answer another question that we've received online.
Great, thanks. So I'm actually going to be answering two questions that are sort of connected. One from Atika in Ontario and another that was anonymously submitted. So the first question is, I am wondering how the Christians running the schools could possibly have interpreted scripture to end up treating children as consistently badly as they did. And the second is, how closely intertwined was religion with the rhetoric of residential schools? How has that shaped faith for Indigenous communities since? So to begin with, religion was fundamental to the daily routine and to the rhetoric of residential schools. So there's a long history of religion driving colonial activity in places like Canada as a means of justifying that activity and as a means of expanding influence of whether these be overseas empire or nation states. And this is absolutely the case in residential schools. But in terms of the daily routine, along with, I would say, manual labor, and to a lesser extent, education, schoolwork, religion was fundamental, structuring daily routines in residential schools. Many survivors remain committed Christians, though the relationship, as you might imagine, can be quite fraught. Religion here is also about projecting church's importance outwards. So it's about demonstrating the numbers of souls saved. So engaging in sort of warfare aimed at the conversion of people, if you like. And it's a tool of fundraising. And I think we need to keep this in mind, that this is a way in which churches publicized their activities and raised funds. So schools are about souls, about saving them, but they're also about money and keeping costs as low as possible. And I think here we see one of the issues driving this conflict between rhetoric and treatment of children.
Thank you, Brian. I'm now going to move the torch over to Erin Millions.
Adele. So my question is by an anonymous question, and both Monique and I are actually going to answer it, and we'll have very different answers. So the question is, I'm trying to learn more and share it with my kids. Sometimes I think it's at odds with what my kids are getting in school, which seems light on content and in some ways light on the truth as I'm coming to know it. So first of all, I would say, based on what I'm seeing in my first year university classroom where I teach first year Indigenous history, I would say I agree. You know, when I was a student long ago, we learned nothing about residential schools. Today, they're learning some stuff about residential schools, but still not enough. I'm also a mom. I have two kids. They're 6 and 9, and they are the grandchildren of a residential school survivor. So we've been talking about residential schools in our home probably since each kid was about 4 years old. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how, if you're a parent, you can approach teaching residential schools to your kids. And I have 4 points that I think are good to keep in mind when you're approaching this material with your children. And the first is choose resources that highlight the voices, Indigenous voices and survivors. And I'm not going to go much into that because I think Monique will probably cover a lot of that in her answer. But choose books that are written by Indigenous authors, listen to the words of survivors, and prioritize those sources in your home when you're talking about residential schools. The second is, alongside teaching the bad things that happen in residential schools, teach resistance and resilience as well. And this is a wider approach to Indigenous history and Indigenous issues than just focusing on residential schools. So the fact that Indigenous languages are still spoken today is a testament to survival and resilience. So teach kids about Indigenous languages that are being spoke today. Take them to powwows and see dances and see cultural practice and show them all the wonderful things that Indigenous people are doing today that they are doing in spite of residential schools. And teach children at the level they understand. And this is advice I heard from author David Alexander Robertson a while ago. And I go into my children's classrooms to teach about residential schools. And I will say that a classroom of grade 2s is much more terrifying than any large audience of adults because they have no filter whatsoever. And so, you know, I do this at kindergarten and grade 2. This year, I'll be doing it with my son in grade 4. And, you know, kindergarten kids can understand that it was sad to be separated from your family for 10 months of the year and not see them. They can understand that it would be sad to be in the same school as your brother and sister and not be able to talk to each other. The book that I use at that young age is When We Were Alone by David Alexander Robertson, which I think is a fantastic book because it teaches about, you know, about the bad parts of residential schools in ways that are not scary for young children, but it also teaches that resistance and the resilience. And it's just a beautiful book. If for older ages, you could use graphic novels like the Chani Wenjack story or Sugar Falls, which is Elder Ross's story. But just teach at the level that the children are at. When I teach in grade 4 this year, you know, I will teach them a little bit more about residential schools. They can understand having their hair cut. They can understand having their clothes taken away and those sort of invasions of body and privacy. And the last point is to take a family approach. So if you as an adult are learning about residential schools, it's okay to tell your kids, I don't know all the answers. And we're going to take this journey as a family and we're going to learn about this together. Go to museums, go to memorial sites, go to residential school sites together, watch films together, read books together. And if you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, I don't know the answer because I never learned about this as when I was young. So let's find the answer together. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to now pass things over to Andrew Woolford.
Great. Thank you, Adele. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Elder Clayton and Elder Betty for being here with us today. My question comes from an anonymous source. It is, I understand that the Truth Commission used cultural genocide to describe residential schools, and then the report about missing and murdered Indigenous women used genocide. How should we be describing what happened in Canada? Do the survivors of the schools have a say in the language being used? Now I'm going to put my 2 minutes in danger by broadening your question a little bit, because I think it's important to look at the creation of genocide law itself. The negotiations that were held in the late 1940s to create the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide did not consult Indigenous people, did not take into account Indigenous laws. It was created in a colonial context. So a lot of the ways in which the genocide concept is framed is in a colonial language. And even in the discussions leading up to that convention, devaluing terminology like primitive and backward peoples were used to describe Indigenous cultures around the world. So this is particularly important because there was an article that was proposed by one of the drafters on cultural genocide, and this was deleted from the convention in part through the influence of the Canadian and American governments, so that this article that would have protected things like language, spirituality, was no longer considered to be part of the genocide concept. So we're dealing with a concept that itself has a political history to it that we have to take into account. And it's one that lacks a key mechanism for understanding cultural techniques of genocide. What remained was Article 2E, which you might have heard discussion of, which is the transfer of children from one group to another. Now, typically, United Nations legal bodies have taken a very narrow interpretation of what that means. I won't go into detail about that now, but certainly recent scholars have made compelling arguments about why it applies to Canada, and I tend to find these quite convincing. As for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's choice of language, we have to remember that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was created as part of the settlement agreement that brought to an end the class action lawsuits that survivors had brought against the Canadian government and churches. And as part of that settlement, they were restricted from examining criminal actions, criminal matters. So Murray Sinclair and the other commissioners had heard from survivors that they wanted the language of genocide somehow featured in the report, but they felt restricted that in terms of adjudicating genocide in any way, shape, or form. So they gravitated to this concept of cultural genocide as a way to use a term that now has no real legal relevance. The National Inquiry for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls did not have those same restrictions. So they were able to employ legal experts to thoroughly consider the question of genocide in Canada. And I think this report is so important. It's why it's one of my recommended readings for people attending today, is because they don't just work with the existing legal frameworks, which I've told you are somewhat problematic. They also push them to better recognize specific Indigenous and gender dimensions of genocide. And these dimensions are actually slowly gaining traction in international jurisprudence as judges are confronted with cases of genocide around the world. So it's not that they're going out on a limb here, but they are, in a way, making the concept do better work. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. I'll turn things over to Monique.
Okay. Just like everyone else, I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very happy to meet both Elders Sandy and Ross. We haven't met before, so it's great to see you here. Like Erin said, I'm going to tackle sort of the resource end, the sort of librarian end of the question that she spoke to in terms of how to learn more and share it with children. I'm going to sort of maybe rattle off a bit of a list of resources, but I know that we're going to be sharing with attendees and online for the wider public as well. Speaking as librarian, I'm sort of I don't know, I'm kind of at the exact midpoint in my career. I started in 2007, and when I started, there was very, very little for children, appropriate for children, that was being published around this topic. And now there is so much more. There's just been a huge sea change in books for children about a range of Indigenous topics generally, but definitely around some of the more difficult topics like residential school. So that's part of the good news of what's happening today, I think. One excellent place to go is the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation's website. I think people should be going there for looking for answers for any number of questions, but they have a really wonderful book list posted on there. They've broken them down by age and grade level. And it's not exhaustive because things keep getting added, and I know they'll continue to update it, but it's certainly more than enough to get a really good start. And if you're kind of looking around going, I have nowhere to start, that list broken down by age and grade is a great place to start. There's also a publication called Every Child Matters, Reconciliation Through Education, that NCTR co-developed. And that's a great kind of like talking through document. It's about 40 pages long, but it's very colorful, full of lots of images. And it's less for children to read on their own, but more for parents and teachers and other caregivers to read and get some guidance into how to think through these topics and how to address them. I also, a little used resource or things that the general public, I think, doesn't always think to access, is that many of the publishers who are publishing these books have taken the time to reach out to Indigenous educators and produce teachers' guides and discussion guides around them. So we're very fortunate here in Treaty 1 to have Portage and Main Press, which has produced just enormous numbers of books around Indigenous topics for children, publishing Indigenous authors, including David Alexander Robertson's books. And many of those books have teacher's guides to go along with them. And they're really wonderful. Certainly as a parent, you might not be looking for a lesson plan, but the questions and the sort of prompts and little bits of guidance that they give for how to speak with different ages of children about the books are certainly something that parents and other caregivers can dip into and feel like maybe you're not going in alone. And of course, the bonus with the stuff being produced from Portage and Main Press is that those guides are being written by Indigenous educators, which is just terrific. And then I think the last thing I'm going to say here, because there is a lot, is I just want to really echo Erin's comment about making it like a family project, a family journey. So in public library land, we talk a lot about the importance of, modeling reading and engaging with text and film and other pieces of cultural production in front of your children for them to see you enjoying that and doing that, right? And I think, it's really important that kids of all ages, see their parents paying attention to the news stories, reading the newspaper stories, reading books about residential school experiences, and reading Indigenous authors, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, just quietly be that example, right? And I think if kids, are growing up around that, naturally at some point, there's going to be questions about it. It's that quiet lesson, and there's so much out there in terms of materials to read and films to watch now, that I think it's very easy to be able to find something and do that modeling right at home for the kids.
Thank you, Monique. And thank you all of our panelists for that first kind of round of questions. I just want to just quickly just alert everyone to a number of resources. These are difficult histories, and we are at a tender moment. And there are a number of resources in particular for folks who are residential school survivors and their families, intergenerational survivors, that have been compiled by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And I just wanted to remind people of some of those and put those up on the screen as we move to our next set of questions that we're going to answer from ones that have been submitted to us in advance. So those are there, and I will now turn things back to where we began our questions and ask if Sean Carleton can take another question for us.
Okay, I'm going to do a bit of a lightning round and try in 2 minutes, I promise Adele, to answer 4 audience questions. So here we go. Someone asked, what is the difference between a residential school and an industrial school? You hear some of these different terms being used. So since the system was in operation for over 100 years, there was some changing terminology over that period. The term residential school was not officially used until the 1920s. When the official system got started in the 1880s, there were 2 different kinds of categories of schools. There were what was known as boarding schools, which were originally supposed to be closer to communities and would accommodate younger children, and then industrial schools, which were often further away from home communities and accommodated older children and youth. In truth, the entire system was modeled on manual labor schools for Indigenous children in the United States. So there was always a boarding aspect and an industrial aspect in the system as a whole. But by the early 20th century, the key feature was that removing children from their home communities and having them live at schools. And so the term residential stuck. John from Winnipeg asks, what was the role of the police and RCMP in all of this? We hear a lot about church and state in terms of the Department of Indian Affairs, but what about police? So the short answer is that provincial police forces, as well as the RCMP, were often used as truant officers for much of the system's operation. That is, they would seek out runaway students and return them to the schools, often getting paid to do so. So there was money involved in that, as well as they would arrest parents or fine parents who refused to send their children. So that was the role of the police. Another anonymous question was, how do I know where residential schools were located in my area? And I will just drop the link here in the chat for everybody. The CBC created a searchable source so that you can type in your postal code and it will show you the residential schools in and around your area. And as someone who grew up down the road from a residential school in North Vancouver, but didn't realize that until my 20s, this is an interesting resource for folks to play around with. Okay, lastly, final question. how do you have conversations about truth and reconciliation with friends and family members who are not necessarily wanting to have those conversations? So this is a hard one, but it gets back to my first answer. So there is a lot of ignorance, resistance, even anti-Indigenous racism out there that is a barrier for sure. But I want to encourage people to engage family and friends, as is sort of coming out as a common theme, to engage with the TRC report specifically. Buy them a coffee, offer to buy them a copy, offer to have a coffee with them to chat about it, encourage them to read the book, and encourage them to seek out events like this, other resources that are being provided, and really learn the truth before forming their opinion about what should be done. Thank you.
That was truly a lightning round. And I'll just give big shout out to everybody who has been really keeping to time and bringing all of the information. So again, I'm going to pass things over to Brian Gettler, who's going to take on another one of the questions that have been submitted.
Yeah, Sean has now set the bar high for us, so I only have one question. It is from Michael S., who asks, were treaties signed all across Canada? And when someone says unceded land, what do they mean? So I guess the short answer for the first half of the question is no. Treaties were not signed all across Canada. Prior to the 1970s, when the sort of what historians call the modern period of treaty making kicks off, treaties were signed in the Maritimes, Ontario, the Prairie provinces, and a very small part of British Columbia. There are two sorts of treaties. Most often, I guess, we could divide these at a more microscopic level if we wanted, but I think the easiest way is to think about two sorts of treaties. The first of these are what are called peace and friendship treaties. These were signed in the Maritimes in the 17th century, 18th century, good grief, sorry. I rarely venture past the 19th, excuse me, the 18th century. Then there were what tend to get called land cession treaties that are signed beginning in Ontario in the late 18th century and then moving westward. Now, this term cession, from which we have the term unceded, which I'll touch on in a second, is from the text of the treaties themselves. Texts that scholarship has shown were not always read or even discussed in detail when treaties were agreed upon. The understanding that First Nations had, and this is particularly the case we know in the case of the numbered treaties, is of land and resource sharing. So this term cession is a legal term that is coming from land treaties from effectively lawyers working for the government. Unceded then is an imperfect recognition that no formal no formal agreement to share the land has been entered into. So it's taking this idea of ceded, saying that treaty land is ceded, though as I've already mentioned, that's not really the case, and making it into a recognition that some sort of formal land sharing agreement is required.
Thank you. Erin, another question for you.
Thanks. Okay, so my question is from Miguel in Winnipeg, and it's a two-part question. So his question is, who ran residential schools? And if the reason for these schools was to assimilate and erase Indigenous culture, what was supposed to replace their own cultural identities? So two very great questions. And I'm going to answer the last one first. So what was supposed to replace the cultural identities that residential school set out to destroy? So there was a vision of the Canadian nation held by Canadian leaders, starting with John A. Macdonald, even before that, and continuing on. And this was a vision that Canada as a nation was going to be white, particularly British, British Canadian, capitalist, and in Western Canada in particular, agricultural based. So residential schools were trying to break down Indigenous cultures, Indigenous identity, separate children from those backgrounds, and create these sort of model citizens that would fit into this white-based, British-led capitalist society, a belief in personal property, skills in agriculture. So that was sort of the goal, but also the goal was to not make them too good at it, because we didn't want them to be too successful and be in competition with, say, white settlers in Western Canada. So when you look at the education of students coming out of the school and how well they were equipped for, say, the job market, they weren't well equipped to move into this society that they were supposed to be assimilating into. So the residential schools failed on both fronts. They failed in genocide and erasing Indigenous culture. They also failed in recreating Indigenous students as these sort of model citizens. The other question is, who ran residential schools? So residential schools, as we use the term, are generally understood as boarding schools for Indigenous students, primarily First Nations and Inuit, although Métis went to them as well, that were established after 1880, were funded by the federal government and run by the churches. And the schools that are sort of most often identified as residential schools are the 139 federally funded residential schools that are included in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement that Andrew referred to earlier. Now, there's lots of schools that fall outside this definition that are still residential schools, and that they were boarding schools whose goal was to erase Indigenous culture and identities. So there were some schools that started before Confederation. The Mohawk Indian Residential School in Brampton is an example of this. It was founded in 1831 and was later folded into the federally funded system. There was schools which are not included in the settlement because there was no survivors alive to make claims under the IRSSA in 2005. One of the examples from my own neighborhood here in Winnipeg is the St. Boniface Indian Residential School, which closed in 1905. And there were also residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador that operated before Newfoundland and Labrador became a province of Canada in 1949. And so therefore those schools that existed in Newfoundland before that time were not part of the federal government system. There were also residential schools that were funded either by a provincial government or a church, sometimes both, sometimes with a little bit of federal funding, but they weren't solely funded like by the federal government. Often these were schools that were meant to serve Métis students who were not primarily the responsibility of the federal government like First Nations and Inuit students were. And these were found in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon, for example. So these schools all had the same goals. They were all residential schools. Sometimes they were funded differently. Sometimes they were run by different people, but essentially they were part of all of the same system. But what this also means is we still have a lot to learn about the residential school system, because our primary source of sort of academic knowledge about residential schools comes from the TRC, and the TRC's mandate was only to study those 130 something schools that were on the list. I think that's all.
Thank you very much. Next up, Andrew's going to take another question.
Great, thank you. My question is also another anonymous question. It's how common were urban residential schools like the one in Winnipeg? I think the school probably being referenced here is the Assiniboia Residential School. It was one of Elder Betty's schools, so I'll make sure I answer well here, because I don't want to get anything wrong. But this was certainly a very unique school. But how there certainly were some residential schools or boarding schools, or the industrial schools actually that Sean was referring to earlier, located close to or within urban settings. Particularly, some of the ones that existed before the 1920s. We see them in places like St. Albert, Edmonton, the Regina School, St. Paul's near Vancouver. There's one in Thunder Bay, etc. So a lot of these early schools followed the model developed by Richard Pratt, who was an American military man, Lieutenant Richard Pratt, who argued in the formation of his Carlisle Industrial School that, quote, we make our greatest mistake in feeding our civilization to the Indians instead of feeding the Indians to our civilization. So the idea was that schools needed to be placed close to white communities so that the influence of these communities would have some alleged beneficent effect on the students at the school. But in Canada, as Sean noted, this changed, and there was a tendency to locate more schools closer to communities and where the missionary societies already had a foothold. So what makes Assiniboia more unique is the fact that it was placed in an affluent neighborhood, as well as the era in which it was established, 1958 to 1973, when a lot of schools elsewhere were closing or changing into hostels where students were housed and sent to other non-Indigenous schools as part of the integration program. So it's also, and this comment I'm a little less sure of, but it's one of the only urban residential high schools that was solely a high school that I'm aware of, although there may have been other ones, because as Erin mentioned, it's a complex system that we're still learning more about, particularly these schools that were outside the TRC agreement. So thank you.
Thank you. Monique.
Okay, the second question that I'm working with here is, how can settler educators bring in the voices of survivors and their families without re-traumatizing? And of course, the two elders on the panel are much more qualified to speak to most of this than I would be, but I'm going to give my perspective as a settler educator myself, who has worked with community doing some of this, and who also fields a fair number of questions from other settler educators saying, we're having an event, we need an elder. Who do you know? Who can we get? And all this kind of thing. And having to talk through and do a little bit of education and awareness about protocols and how to step forward in a good way with doing those kind of events. I guess my short answer to it at the beginning here is that, there may already be elders and survivors and intergenerational survivors in your community that are already doing this work very publicly. And, you see their name in a news story, or you heard that they went to, your child's school or a friend of a friend's school. You see them out there in the community doing this. And this is certainly the case here in Winnipeg, where just the extraordinary generosity from any number of survivors and their family members. There are folks. And so you have a sense that maybe they might be open to that kind of thing. And I certainly think, if you feel like you can, make contact. I think the important thing is to take the lead of survivors and their families. Don't assume that you can just, take these extraordinary individuals and plunk them down into your event. And, your event needs to fit whatever their needs and their stories and how they want to tell them are, right? Including respecting protocols. So I would say if it's not something that can happen organically, or if you don't, have some kind of connection or have a sense of who to reach out to, I myself am never quite comfortable I couldn't cold call an elder. Right? I'll be honest, it's an awkward thing to talk about, but but unless there's some kind of existing relationship there or through someone else, I think there's other ways of bringing in those stories. And that gets to the second piece of information I want to share here. And this is a quote from the NCTR site. And it says, the spiritual core of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation will forever be the statements, documents, and other materials gathered by the TRC. This is a sacred bundle that the NCTR will protect and preserve for all time for the benefit of all Canadians. The TRC site provides access to literally hundreds, and they're adding more all the time, of recordings, video recordings of survivor testimonies. These are shared off of the information guide that I shared in the chat. When you're looking through their archive, a tip is to look for things that are listed under sharing panels. There's an extraordinary amount of material there. And those stories have already been told and shared, right? And given permission to be shared. And I think, you know, other than reading the report, as Sean mentioned, engaging with some of those direct survivor voices is really important. There's also many other sources for bringing in voices of survivors into educational settings. And those three websites that the Legacy of Hope Foundation has up. One called Where Are the Children, one on the Métis experience, Forgotten Métis, and one on the Inuit experience, We Were So Far Away. And all of those sites either share text, a direct text of survivor stories, or a whole suite of videos, 20-minute videos, half-hour videos, that kind of thing. And of course, the TRC itself published the Survivors Speak. It's a very readable, quite accessible volume. Certainly, I would say, depending on subject matter, anywhere from junior high up, and the literacy level on it. And there's extraordinary direct text of survivor testimony that was shared during the TRC. So I think there's lots of ways to bring in survivor voices that don't necessarily bring someone in person. Of course, if that can be done in a great way, you know, I think that's wonderful, but there are other options out there. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank Elder Clayton Sandy, Elder Betty Ross, Kara Sievewright, our panelists, Kayla Johnson from the whole team at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the Center for Human Rights Research, and especially Pauline Tennant. We had hoped that we might possibly have time to take some questions that have been submitted as the event has gone on, but we are now closing in on just the final few minutes. So I'm just going to end with sharing some resources that we have compiled. And I want to make sure I have this on the appropriate slide thing so you can see it in all of its glory. I don't think I have that because the Zoom thing is covering up the slide thing. Let me see if I can do that. Oh, well, we're just going to have to view it and it's in perfect size here. There's some of the resources that were mentioned in the course of the conversation. Getting started regarding the TRC executive summary and reports, learning about the schools near where you live. A residential school information guide compiled and available at the Winnipeg Public Library, thanks to Monique. A recent post by Sean Carleton and Daniel Heath Justice in the conversation. And some published books around survivor histories, including Elder Betty Ross's story in Sugar Falls, by David Alexander Robinson. Next thing to talk about here is what does it mean to do the work as a non-Indigenous person? We think this means reframing our thinking. There's a tendency to see the challenges of reconciliation in ways that continue to think in terms that do not help us. And we instead would urge you to think of settler colonialism as the problem. Listen to survivors, listen to history, don't center your own feelings, learn the truth. And this is one of the hashtags we had for this event, which is that we need truth before reconciliation. And keep working. Build relationships and show up, call out racism, institutional, individual, and otherwise when we hear it. Donate money if you have it to appropriate organizations and continue to do the work. So we are, I think, just slightly beyond our intended stop time of 1 p.m. And with that, I will again thank everyone for their engagement, for the generosity, for their showing up, for starting us off and continuing us along the road to hopefully having better conversations and finding ways that non-Indigenous people and that settlers can do the work and take some of the responsibility for the histories that have shaped us all. So thank you very much.
Egosani, Kinanas. Kinanas komit na. Anus kay gisigisigag. Tabamistay itaminao. Ngiyamiyawag. Ugaminog musuminog. Egites tamwagik. Umenegagisi animu tamagan us kay gisigisigag. I'm so very grateful to be here today. There was so much information put forward. There were so many awesome questions, very powerful questions. As I was sitting here or holding my eagle feather, I was able to translate everything, not everything, but the most important pieces that were asked to the spiritual grandmothers and grandfathers that are here with us today, to the best of my ability. It's about, how do you say that? It's reciprocal, right? It's a give and take relationship. You hear our stories. Some people don't necessarily have to believe, because my day to day, I don't really believe everything I hear.
Mhm.
I don't really believe everything I see, but you know what? I challenge in good ways, in proper ways that I could understand. And what was happening today was quite emotional, because as survivors, we, speaking from my own experience, the two systems that I went through, they took so much from me. You know what? They took my my childhood. I wasn't able to really be a child in there. It was more like a prison. The same thing with my teenage years, young adulthood, because it's the circle of life I'm discussing today. But in order to be here today, I had to forgive Betty first. Because you know what? I was so angry after the residential school experience. When I graduated from the residential school in 1968 here in Winnipeg, I didn't know who I was. I was left in this world with nothing. Absolutely nothing. And there were no supports. And of course, in the systems, there was no medical attention that we got. You know, in my case, I felt as though they were literally trying to crucify me for who I was. But you know what? Didn't succeed. Here I am today. So I think it's up to each and every one of the survivors to heal holistically, to have that voice. Because I didn't have a voice. I didn't have anything right after the residential school. And I took it upon myself and I said to myself, you know what? I am going to take back what's mine, what's rightfully mine, and get that voice in good ways. Because I had to forgive Betty first, because I was so angry at the systems. And then I had to look at the two residential schools, the one from Sugar Falls this happened in my Michigan Cree Nation, my own community. It was right across from where I lived. And they cut off my roots. But in a way, it's all written here in Sugar Falls. I was lucky in a way because my father, who custom adopted me, put all those, those survival skills, those sacred teachings within me. But I lost them throughout the system because I was so, I don't know, I couldn't even sit there without a nun hitting me. Today I carry these scars. I can't hear from my left ear. Migraines. When you talk about re-traumatization, oh my goodness. You know, the residential schools either made you or broke you. Okay, so I chose to fight my way through. It took everything and my willpower to be where I am today. I didn't believe what they told me in a residential schools when I was only a child. But you know, when you're a child, you just take everything, right? You know yourself, when you're a child, you just take everything. But the thing that came forward to me as the most powerful words that my father gave me when that priest came and pulled me out of cut off my roots. My father said to me in Cree, to be a good girl, to listen. And I think that's what sustained me throughout my my time, my years in that era. I just sat there and took everything and I listened. And I went through trauma after trauma after trauma. After the residential school, I was totally lost. I went to every church that you could think of. Trying to find that whatever that I was looking for. I didn't even know myself. I took my young children from Winnipeg and we went to Brandon. I went to Brandon University. I wanted to upgrade my education and I'm glad I did. I didn't find it there. And then we moved to Saskatoon. And that's where I got my certificate in Bachelor of Indian Social Work. And I didn't find it there. And then I went to PA, Thompson, you know, even back to my reserve. I couldn't find anything there. Because my heart was just searching for something, something down. I didn't even know what it was. So I came back to Winnipeg, and my first grandson was born in 1995. And I was trying to hug him, kiss him, love him. And he just cried and just shouted, screamed, just shiverings, like as if he's seen something sinister in me. And you know what? That's when it hit me that I had to start my healing journey because my generations were coming, right? And that's how it started. And that's been going on 30 years now. It's been such a powerful journey. I'm able to find my own voice. I was able to find a beautiful culture that was out there. The songs, the ceremonies. Wow. You have to walk in my shoes, they say, to be able to feel how I feel today. Because it is so powerful. It is so sacred. What else can I say? Is it 2020 when that is so There are no words in the English term to probably properly describe, but I have it in my Cree language. But the one question I want to leave in this generation is the question, why? Why residential schools? Did those schools in that era, how do I say that? My questions are in that book, in our book, why? And that question is going to ring out throughout the generations. Why? Why residential schools? Did they accomplish their purpose? And that's for each and every one of us to ask ourselves. Ask yourself, what is the truth? What is reconciliation? Reconciliation will never be in this generation. It's going to take generations and generations and generations to arrive at true reconciliation. And this is the message that's coming. And as I hold this feather today, it represents truth. And again, today, I am so grateful for each and every one of you. You know, in a way, you answered your own questions. Or the academics today, I think they're just, I don't, when you speak, I say to myself, you know, that's what I want to say, but I don't have the proper terms to use because I am so, how do you say that, saturated in my language and in my culture. But I mentioned earlier that I don't believe everything I hear. I don't believe everything I say. I mean, I hear and what I read, sorry, but I challenge in good ways. And today was pretty powerful. The questions that were raised, you know, oh my, they were just, I think they came from the heart, right? We want to learn. So again, I want to say that it's a learning curve every day for each and every one of us. No matter if we're just starting in grade school, you know, I just love being in, with the school systems because you know why? I'm able to be in their level. My little children, kindergarten from grade 8 and upwards, because I'm a child again, I'm at their level. I'm a teenager again, I'm at their level. A young adult at their level. So it is so powerful, the journey with the schools today. And as another healing journey that I'm on today. And I just, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to wish everybody a wonderful journey. Words of wisdom. I think I went beyond. Words of wisdom. Be grateful for every breath. Please take a deep breath with me and be grateful for that breath. And every step that you take on Mother Earth, be grateful for that step that you take. And I hope, my hope is that you realize and recognize where that breath comes from and where that step comes from. So that there is so much that needs to be learned, but we learn every day, right? But everything comes from here, from our hearts. That's where all the answers lie. I know, because it took me on a journey to find the answers that I was looking for. Ebersani, Inanaskumitnawa. I just want to thank each and every one of you today. Very powerful, very sacred. Ebersani.
Thank you.
I don't think we could have asked for a more powerful and important set of closing words. So thank you very much for that, Elder Betty.